to congratulate Joseph Boakai on Friday night has saved the country, which has a history of brutal civil conflict from weekend of tensions. And this is where also we can see a very interesting editorial that we had also in the Star as well, where they're congratulating and saying Africa should pick up the baton, or they should also follow suit as far as conceding defeat is concerned when it comes to general election. I just want us to focus on that a bit, Peter Kagwanja, because this seems to be very novel within the African politics. This never happens, and right now he has been able. We've seen how it has been neck and neck, yes. And then they went for a runoff.
A runoff, yes.
And then now we have the ultimate winner.
Yes, and I think that is the way elections were designed to be. That they do not, the elections should not be the source of instability, because what African countries and other countries in the world require is stability post-election. And that is the essence of democracy. The problem we have with democracy now, and which explains why sometimes you hear people talking about the popularity of authoritarian systems, is because of the guarantee, the certainty that they bring, that within authoritarian systems, you change governments peacefully. You may not like the system, but you are guaranteed one thing, that is stability. The problem with democracy is that it has not given that certainty of stability after an election. So what George Weah is doing in terms of writing African history of elections is that it is possible on the African continent to adhere to the doctrine of peaceful transition. Because at the heart of democracy, whether in the US, in France, or anywhere, it is that doctrine of peaceful transition or peaceful handing over of power. Now, when we had in America, when we had the situation where Trump and Biden were not able to easily transit, and there were those incidences in the Capitol Hill, America looked very, very much like any African country. And within a period of 4 years, America was looking very, very much like any other developed country in regard to democracy. What was in peril at that time? Because the doctrine of peaceful handing over of power with the dignity and the reassurances that are required are there. Now, we can say George Weah is special, as you put it lightly, very nicely, that his sportsmanship, his experience as a sportsman, and that you can always lose a game, but you don't start by disputing or sending your followers to the streets. You start by accepting and getting the transition. And if there are any challenges, then they follow thereafter. It is the nature of football. When you lose, you accept it, the whistle blows, then it's over. Then if there are changes or appeals to be made, you make them after. When you look at the example of Kenya, why are we always in the cycle of elections, violence, which undermines our economy? It has absolutely nothing to do with the Kenyans not voting right. It has nothing to do with the Kenyans not investing enough in elections. We said we pay $25 for every ballot. Why then do we have that kind of a situation? Because we don't have leaders that adhere and respect the doctrine of peaceful transfer of power. That is the simple cause. And what George Weah has shown is that it is possible, even when you are unhappy. The Liberian election cannot be described as peaceful. We've seen people dying. We've seen tensions. We have seen people in a very, very closely contested election with the opposition leader literally, struggling. But George Weah is not just magnanimous. So in short, what he said is that you lose your election in grace. And you accept your victory with magnanimity and humility. That's what democracy is about. That is a good lesson for Kenya.
Indeed. Right. Let's hear from
So I think you know, and actually let me just twist a little bit Prof's earlier comment. I think we can thank the people of Liberia, and particularly the politicians, for not behaving like the politicians of America during the last elections, and raising the standard of democratic electoral transfer in the way that they have done. I mean, I think, you know, there are many things to pick from this election. The first is how hopeful a picture it gives us in a region that has been plagued by coups and unconstitutional seizures of power. So this is the context, I think, not just in Liberia, but also more broadly. Joseph Boakai, the incoming president, of course, is not an unknown figure. He was the vice president to Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, and he lost against George Weah in 2017, but as democracy allows, he got a chance to run again and has now won. I think the challenge for him really to avoid the experience of a one-term presidency will be to move on the issues that Liberians have been very concerned about with regards to George Weah, and some of them are the following of, you know, first of all, you know, that there has been very little action taken on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with regards to the 14-year conflict that was there. Very many of the people who perpetrated human rights abuses were not prosecuted in court. Essentially, there was a forgive and forget policy that allowed for no action to be taken. So I think that's the first area. There have been concerns, you know, not least by Amnesty, others, prison reform, and really sexual and gender-based violence issues in Liberia have never come back to a level that has been acceptable to very many Liberian women and men. And I think the other one is really entrenching a spirit of democracy that does not infringe on the rights of people and their freedom of expression. So these would be some of the areas, but as always with all countries at this time, the cost of living, the economic renewal, and developing a productive capacity. So I think these are the challenges for the president-elect as he comes in. But all in all, a good result for Liberia in terms of process, and secondly, also a good result for Africa.
All right. Let's hear from Nomidamba.
Dubal, the continent of Africa, from the beginning, from the 60s, had a choice to have a mix of communist leading party or government and democracy. And the entire continent, you know, and Kagwanja can correct me, the entire continent chose democracy, you know, with no exception at all. So democracy requires certain processes that are fundamentally very important and building. And time again, with the exception of Nyerere, you know, and South Africa, we fail to meet that criteria over and over again. And a lot of literature is written about we're not going anywhere, we're going backward. And so George Weah, who is really not a politician, but followed the principle, like my friend here just said, of football. When you are defeated, you move on gracefully. That's what sportsmanship is all about. But he's now demonstrated one of the best examples for Africa that we can pick up and say, here it is. Democracy is actually taking place in Africa. This is a country that was torn apart, you know, not too long ago. People turn on each other, family turn on each other. Our friends who lost everything in that country, who ran away. Now, we back now, and democracy is taking place, and development is taking place, because I know the people who are working there, either with the UN or the embassies. Things are changing in Nigeria. And that point to, yes, there is hope. There is light behind the tunnel. As I talk to the business investors who are using what is called exaggerated risk, you know, in the continent of Africa, I said, yeah, here's Liberia. That has now changed, and the country now will focus on development. So that's where I'm coming.
Fantastic. And of course, you can grab a copy, as you can see it here, of the Standard, where they've written the editorial. If my director will just pick it up in full, we read alongside to congratulate them. Outgoing Liberian President George Weah did something rare, as we've heard from a panelist, among African incumbents with constitutional room to continue their welcome in office. The former FIFA World Cup Player of the Year called his opponent Joseph Boakai on Friday to concede defeat when it became clear the latter had garnered an unassailable lead in the runoff. In doing so, he has been hailed for saving the country, which has a history of brutal civil conflict, from a weekend of tension. As one rights activist put it, such action on part of a sitting president is very, very, very rare. It may be one of those isolated events, but it bodes well for African democracy, an indication that it has the potential for cementing its maturity. What has stood out, I should say, is that Weah chose to concede the race 3 days before the official results were out. Ordinarily, incumbent presidents insist on staying put, even when all indications are they are headed for clear defeat, often maneuvering to interfere with process and change the results in favor, and often with deadly consequences. That is what, for instance, happened in 2010 when Ivory Coast President Laurent Gbagbo had the unconstitutional court overturn his rival Alassane Ouattara's victory. And you can read the rest of the details there inside today's Standard. Let's head over to Ethiopia, where a second round of peace talks between Ethiopia's government and a rebel group aimed at ending a decade-old conflict in the country's largest region, Oromia, has ended without a deal. Both sides said on Tuesday the negotiations in Tanzania between the government and the Oromo Liberation Army, that is OLA, followed talks in April and May that also failed to produce an agreement. The OLA is an outlawed splinter group of a formerly bland opposition party that returned from exile in 2018. Its grievances are rooted in the alleged marginalization and neglect of people in Oromia, which surrounds the capital Addis Ababa. The violence in Oromia has killed hundreds of people in the past few years and has been one of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's main security headaches since the end of a 2-year civil war in the northern Tigray region last year due to intransigence of the other party. The talks have come to an end without agreement, read Wan Hussein, that is Abiy's national security advisor, on Twitter. Also, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said on Monday he was completely committed to his government's scheme to send asylum seekers to Rwanda after the UK's top judges last week ruled it was unlawful. I'm completely committed to doing what is necessary, get those flights off and that scheme up and running, he said in response to a question following a speech in London. 5 judges at the Supreme Court unanimously upheld an appeal court ruling that found there was a real risk of deported refugees having their claims in the East African country wrongly assessed or being returned to their country of origin to face persecution. The ruling undermines one of the Prime Minister's key pledges to stop the deports. The government claimed that the 140 million euro, sterling pounds, I should say, Rwanda scheme will be a key deterrent for growing numbers of asylum seekers reaching the UK via small boats traveling across the channel. And South African lawmakers voted in favor of closing down the Israeli embassy in Pretoria and suspending all diplomatic relations until a ceasefire is agreed in its war with Palestine Islamist group Hamas in Gaza. The resolution is largely symbolic, as it will be up to President Cyril Ramaphosa's government whether to implement it. A presidency spokesman said Ramaphosa's notes and appreciates Parliament's guidance on South Africa's diplomatic relations with Israel, particularly on the status of the embassy. Ramaphosa and senior foreign minister or ministry officials have been vocally critical of Israel's leadership during its devastating military campaign against Hamas in the densely populated Gaza Strip, calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate them for potential war crimes. The Israeli embassy did not immediately respond to a request for comment on Monday. The Israeli ambassador in Pretoria was recalled to Tel Aviv for consultations ahead of the vote, which on Tuesday was resoundingly adopted by 248 against 91 margin. The parliamentary resolution was brought by the Opposition Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, party last week when the governing African National Congress pledged to support what has been a central diplomatic stance. All right, we can just comment on those stories. First of all, just to begin with you, Irungu Houghton, especially on the asylum seekers and the Supreme Court ruling on the UK. This has been an ongoing debate we've discussed here previously, and now it has been determined, but still we can see he's setting his face like a Flintstone. That is, he's saying we're going full steam ahead regardless. That is what the Prime Minister says.
Yeah, it is baffling how vested the Prime Minister has been in this program. Of course, it came to the public eye back in April 2022, so we're almost into the second year of this abortive and now declared unlawful solution to outsource your obligations under the Geneva Convention to another country. I think the judgment of the court was important in a couple of respects. One is that it identified the risks. The no risk assessment had been done in terms of the risks that would face asylum seekers should they be relocated to Rwanda. They noted that several asylum seekers have in the past been unlawfully renditioned or transported back to places of danger by the Rwandese government. But I think the other 2 points was really around the violation of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is a is a UN international convention, but also the EU convention itself. So why the Prime Minister wants to proceed with this really is just baffling, rather than looking at its own obligations to the international humanitarian community. There is an interesting moment, which is that Suella Braverman, who introduced this, is no longer the Foreign Secretary, and the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, has now taken a step up, down, sideways to become the Foreign Secretary. It's a bit of an interesting thing to have a Prime Minister, and maybe there's hope for African presidents that in future they can come back as ministers of something, and they don't have to take retirement options, particularly as we have younger presidents coming to bear. But I think, my first comment is just, let it lie. Just invest in a professional, human rights-based, modern refugee and asylum seeker program in the United Kingdom, rather than trying to ask other countries to take on that responsibility for you. I do want to talk about Gaza as well, so I hope you...
Yeah, we will come to Gaza as well. Let's just hear from Peter Kagwenjo on the...
Should we concentrate on the refugee thing?
Yeah, we'll come to you on the refugee, then we'll come to Gaza sequentially as I ask the questions.
I wanted to talk about Ethiopia, but let me...
so that we're not all over the map, but can be just sequentially with
this. I agree. Now, first and foremost, from the beginning, we say that that whole operation is against the Geneva Convention, whether we're talking about the 1951 or we're talking about its 1967 version, or we are actually talking about the African Union Convention on Refugees. It's a total violation. So, and that put Rwanda on the map. Whether Rwanda want to be the country, pioneering on this kind of a path, when much of its population is in Congo and other African countries, when the president himself has spent more time as a refugee than as a national of any country, to the point that he actually grew up in Uganda as a Ugandan rather than a Rwandese. So putting together a predictable, fair and just refugee regime must be Rwanda's responsibility within the African Union and East African community. For Britain and other European countries, their worries is just political, because the issue of migration is a hot potato either in America, Canada, or else, because there is this feeling that has been put by Western populists that their countries are under attack, they're being invaded. And I wonder what the British think, because if you wanted a kingdom, I mean an empire where the sun never set, you should also accept an empire where people move freely within that empire. Britain, post-Brexit Britain, after 2016, is all about expanding the Commonwealth as a new area of cultural, historical, and economic interaction. In fact, it's the next hope of Britain that the Commonwealth, well organized and coordinated, will form one of the five blocks that are supposed to be, dominant in our multipolar world order. After America, Russia, China, and now we'll have the Commonwealth and then the European Union. That's the way the world is beginning to emerge. And therefore, this kind of a policy cuts, basically goes ill for, a Britain that wanted to consolidate its former empire into a now more benign, Commonwealth of nations, where wealth is now shared, population is shared, human resources move freely. So I don't know what the Prime Minister is up to. And now remembering, and it's very interesting, because they say in psychology, if you're once oppressed, the tendency is also to oppress. That's the trend. You've seen that with Israel, and now we have seen this with the Prime Minister. He himself, his grandparents were migrants from India. We don't know whether they came in as refugees or fortune seekers of whatever way, but they went to Britain because they were looking for better opportunities. Why would you prevent others also enjoying that opportunity, becoming prime ministers like yourself? He should be the first defending that policy, given his own ancestry. So there is a contradiction in personality there. But I think in conclusion, one can say that the whole operation, the whole thinking, the whole scheme is contrary to any law that we know of, whether it's Rwandese law or British law or international humanitarian law. It's completely against it.
All right. Why was Rwanda really receptive to this arrangement? And what will be their reaction right now?
While there is a number of points that my colleagues here pointed that are really baffling about this arrangement. Number one, there is a Geneva Convention that is universal, spelled out very clearly about protecting refugees. Then there is a desire of a refugee themselves and the country of destination. When Liberia and Sierra Leone were in turmoil, you don't expect a Liberian to leave and go to Sierra Leone or vice versa. They go to a place that they expect to be able to protect their human right, so that they're escaping from an incredible situation. That is the desire, which is protected by the UN Convention. Now, this arrangement, and Sunet having been born not in the, is conservative, there's no question, but it's much more open conservative than the others who started this program. For him to continue doing this is baffling to all of us. And for Rwanda to accept this kind of arrangement, it's also baffling. And that's the area where I'd like to live.
All right. We can head now to what is happening, especially in South Africa. I can see here, as I mentioned earlier, that South Africa is calling for the arrest of Netanyahu. It says the South African government has called on the International Criminal Court to issue arrest warrant for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. My director may just pick it up. By mid-December, Minister in the presidency, that is Kumbutso Shazaveheni, said if ICC did not do this, it will signal a total failure of global governance. Israel says it is defending itself following the October 7th attack by Hamas, which saw 1,200 people killed and more than 200 taken hostage. It says it is trying to minimize civilian casualties, but Ms. Shahaveni said the Israeli government was trying to clear most of Gaza of Palestinians and occupy it. South Africa, along with Bangladesh, Bolivia, Comoros, Djibouti, submitted a referral to ICC to investigate whether war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Gaza. South Africa has long been vocal supporter of Palestinian cause. It has announced withdrawal of its diplomats from Israel and suggested that position of Israel's ambassador to Pretoria was becoming untenable. This was in the People Daily. Let's just begin with you, Irungu Houghton, on this. I'm still trying to switch from Houghton to Houghton to Houghton.
That was perfect, Debab. Thank you very much. My sister, who watches this show regularly, will actually ask for your telephone number. Coming back to Gaza, and actually just to mention, really, the South Africa story really is that's not the center stage of the story. It is an important development, but I think we have to always come back to what's happening in Gaza right now. And you and I and everybody who's watching this program probably have got to a point where we have despaired with what's happening in Gaza. We've stopped watching those images, those videos, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that, 2 million people are starving in Gaza at the moment. 1.6 million people have been displaced. 13,000 people are dead, many of them children. 100 UN officials are among them. And in South Africa, the UN agency dropped the flag to half-mast, and 50 journalists. And we don't even have the numbers of health workers as well. So I think, really starting with what is the gravity of the injustice that is happening with the bombardment and the blockade of Gaza at the moment is a good place to come back to. I think the South African position has been bold and concurs with the Amnesty position, which is that war crimes have taken place, that the International Criminal Court must begin the process of prosecution for these war crimes. And we have, as Amnesty, a number of volunteers and members who are actually collecting testimonies that we hope one day will find their way at The Hague to essentially hold those that are responsible for what has happened over the last month or so accountable. I think another area of, let me just stay with South Africa for a minute. I think the other thing about the South African decision has been the interesting way in which the opposition has triggered the government to be bolder in its condemnation. And I think there are lessons here for the Kenyan opposition and the Kenyan ruling party in terms of what would be a bolder, more rights-based approach to what's happening in Gaza. President Ruto on November the 11th made an important statement. We don't remember it enough, but in Riyadh he spoke about violence and conflict against civilians. He spoke about the need for the two-state solution to be reintroduced. He spoke about an end to the blockade and a ceasefire. And again, like the position that was taken by our embassy to the UN, I felt proud to associate myself as a Kenyan with those comments. But I think we need to go further now, and I think we have to talk about either recalling our ambassador back to Kenya or closing the Israeli embassy until we have a ceasefire. Fortunately, we have a bit of a glimmer of hope, which is that in the last 24 hours we've heard that the talks have begun in terms of the
temporary ceasefire,
the hostages and that the Red Cross may have access. But I think we need to call for a complete ceasefire rather than just a cessation of hostilities for a temporal period.
You did. Of course, just to add me to that is that the Israeli government and Hamas agreed to a temporary ceasefire to allow the release of hostages held in Gaza in exchange for Palestinians imprisoned in Israel. The deal calls for a 4-day infighting, during which a 4-day pause, not infighting, 4-day pause in fighting, during which Israel will hold its military offensive in Gaza with Hamas, while Hamas frees 50 of the roughly 240 hostages it and other militants are holding. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said this: the first hostages should be or to be released are women and children. Israel will free some 150 Palestinian prisoners and allow additional humanitarian aid into Gaza. Peter Kagwanja.
I think it is fair to say that Israel may be winning the military war because of its enormous and well-equipped military and intelligence, but it has lost for the first time the diplomatic war globally. So South Africa's decision to to close its embassy, diplomatic mission with Israel is not exceptional. In fact, this is happening across the world, from India to Mauritania. I don't know how many embassies, out of the 12 embassies and consulates Israel has in Africa, you would wonder how many are still active. Mm-hmm. Most of them are closed. In the other cases, it's actually Israel itself that is closing its embassies, not the host countries, mm-hmm. In fear of retaliation. Mm-hmm. Remember also, this is not Israel versus the Muslims or versus Arab countries. The game has changed. The Jewish population globally is the one that is actually demonstrating against against Israel, leading even to a closure of embassy like the one in Washington. That was really a shocker. It was very surprising that the embassy of Israel in Washington would be closed for whatever reason. Now, what that means is that Israel has no option but to negotiate. And we have never had a better chance to realize the two-state solution than now. This is really the best case. And Hamas has got itself a kind of, you can say, it is now the strongest voice for the Palestinians. And the PLO and other bodies now, have to basically follow Hamas, because it's now the most popular of the forces, of the Palestinian voices. Now, what that means is that Netanyahu will have basically at some stage to face criminal prosecution. Why? Because of the action he took against the civilians. He never harmed Hamas. Hamas are still going on with whatever they're doing from the beginning. He has not even been able to liberate the Israelis being captured by Hamas. And Hamas doesn't seem to be doing any harm to them, because if they are still intact wherever they are, the propaganda that Israel has been peddling that most of them are dead and so on doesn't seem to be cutting. So we would reiterate with what President Ruto has said, and it's good to appreciate how far Kenya has come in terms of synchronizing its own policy with the one of the African Union, and also moving ahead to basically support the situation as it is. One, we need a two-state solution. And that means that, Israel has to pull out of the position that's captured, because military is not a guarantee that it will hold these areas, given the diplomatic backlash that it is getting. Mm-hmm. And two, that it has to recognize Hamas not as a terrorist group, but a partner in seeking for permanent solution. And not just Hamas, but the larger Palestinian political leadership, whether it's in Gaza or West Bank. That would be there. I think for a number of Arab countries, this is really a challenge, because for the first time you saw, some of the Arab countries that are supposed to provide leadership did not provide leadership in this particular case. They stood by and watched as this genocide was going across. And one wonder whether this is also not going to destabilize or lead to certain, uprisings within the Arab world. Particularly because of the intensity of this genocide. Finally, I think it all boils down to the power of social media, mm-hmm. in highlighting this, because it is not the militaries, it is not the Israelis, but the power of social media in exposing some of this. Remember also the West, particularly the mainstream, Google, X, former Twitter, and so on, have tried to manage the situation, but somehow it has gotten out of the way through, TikTok and mm-hmm. other alternative social media platforms. So social media has played the role in basically liberating Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let's hear from Naomi Dambo briefly.
Well, a number of points or trends to look for. One is there is no doubt that Bibi Netanyahu has been one of the most extreme right-wing leader in the state of Israel. But there are movements, very powerful movement that may change the events, from extreme right-wing Israel government to a more moderate that will much more be aligned to a two-state solution. One is Saudi Arabia role is very critical here, and other Arabs are watching the role Saudi Arabia is playing. So while that is going on, there is also an internal convulsion, let me say, of Israelis themselves that I know, that I've met with, that I've listened to, who are now speaking out. For instance, they held the view that the Netanyahu role was to rescue the refugees first, rescue the captured Israelis first, rather than going in and entering this intensive warfare which is started. So that is being watched, that's thoroughly understood, and that's why the Israelis overseas are reacting. They're not reacting to the Israelis and Arab fighting, but the move that Netanyahu is probably one of the most hated person on this world. Now, then you have to understand where Israel has come from and where Israel is. Israel is one of the most powerful countries in the world today, militarily and also economically in the Middle East. Secondly, we realize there is no such thing like permanent security. Israel has everything to do with security, but that security is penetrated. As the advancement of technologies come in, it will be penetrated before. So we're now coming back to a two-state solution. Settle the Arab desire, the Palestinian desire, and settle the Israel desire. And what I'm concerned about from the African standpoint is South Africa seems to be playing what I call Lone Ranger. There is AU stand here, which we all need to concur with, which Kenya has now moved more closer to. But before we even do that, South Africa already made a step. Whether it was Brexit and now shutting down the embassy. Is that helpful, for instance, from African standpoint? Because Europeans are negotiating collectively. Mm-hmm. If you watch, they're moving together. If Sweden closed, then Italy closed. That's the way they're moving. But this Lone Ranger, how is it going to help the coast of Africa, where we stand from? So I have a big question.
Indeed.
About South Africa.
A very pertinent question, but let's just hear what Ramaphosa himself had to say regarding this situation.
Unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food, and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Ramaphosa there. So we want to just, I think Peter Kagwanja, you indicated you wanted to comment on Ethiopia because I can see we're only remaining with 8 minutes, we're done.
Yes.
Then we can consider also giving our closing remarks.
Yes, I think...
So that the talks have failed.
The talks have failed, and nobody expected them to succeed. And if they did succeed, that was not a solution to Ethiopia. Why do I say so? Ethiopia has been having a five front kind of a conflict within itself. Obviously, what came to the top was the conflict with Tigray. And the reason why the conflict with Tigray took such a high profile was because of the involvement of the Tigrayan people in the military. And therefore, it took a military confrontation for the government to weaken the Tigrayan role in the security forces. But what is now emerging in other parts is that we have implosion in the Amhara region with the Fano fighters. And we've seen a lot of jets, drones and other technologies moving from UAE and other Arab countries in support of the government in Addis Ababa. We have this conflict now with the Oromia, and Oromia is actually supposed to be the hotbed if we talk about the ethnic nature of African politics, because Abiy himself is an Oromo, and therefore he needs to have 100% support. But the people who came from exile and other earlier fighters are saying that it's not serving their cause. Now we're having confrontation between the Oromia, the Oromo, and the Amhara. Now, we are also having a confrontation between the Tigray and the Amhara. And down deep south, we have the Sidamos and other minorities asking for their own region. And we have the Ogaden, where the conflict has never been solved fully. Now, so what it means that the kind of approaches that the government is taking, basically dealing with one ethnic group, in terms of its agreement with it, is not doing any good to Ethiopia at all. So Abiy need to do the following. First, take a holistic approach to the conflict resolution in Ethiopia. And two, consider that resolution as not a challenge to his power, but an unfinished business in the liberation, in the reform of the Ethiopian monarchical system. And thirdly, embark on a national convention, not this piecemeal approach to resolving a larger national crisis. Now, if he has a national convention, that means that he brings all the fighting forces under one roof. And then they talk with two results. One, a constitution for Ethiopia. And two, the definition of a citizen in that country. Why? Because the Tigrayans have always considered themselves as the fighting the military. The Amhara as the ruling class. The Oromo were always considered as producers of food, hewers of water and drawers of wood in the Ethiopian monarchy, which has not changed. And the minorities are just there. They have no role. The Sidamos, the Afar, and others have no role in the state. And the Somalis have always considered themselves non-members of the Ethiopian monarchy. They would rather be in the Somali Federation on this other side. So in that case, Abiy is dealing with a major legacy of the Solomonic dynasty. And he needs to consider it as such. It is not a challenge to his power. It is not a challenge to him as a person. It is simply a historical mission he has.
What do you mean by major challenge of Solomonic dynasty?
The Solomonic dynasty is what I have talked about. Haile Selassie, the Emperor Haile Selassie was a heir to a dynasty that traces its origin from the Queen of Sheba.
Queen of Sheba, yes.
Who was supposed to have been a good friend of King Solomon, and because of that, through King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, the Amhara were born, and through one of the maiden of Queen of Sheba and Solomon, then the Tigrayas were born. And therefore, this now becomes the official ruling class. The military, the Tigrayans, and these. But both sons of Solomon's, but different women. So
from that particular history, yes, and the Solomonic palace itself,
yes,
we had and the many concubines and 1,000 wives that he had.
Yes.
So emerges the Tigrayans, yes, and the Amharans as well.
And the Amhara emerge as the ruling class. One military, the other one official. Then from there we have the Oromo, who are the majority, almost 60%. And they are the ones who are growing food for the monarchy. For thousands of years, they grew food for the monarchy. The Somalis had no place. The just were included in the Ethiopian empire through the 1884 partition of Africa, which Ethiopia took part in. And then these other Sidamos were part of the definition of boundaries between Ethiopia and the British, particularly in the Kenyan side. So they were put in there. Their political and social role in Ethiopia has not been very clearly defined. Anthropologists study them like they exist in no state. So Abiy's historic mission, and he's young enough to accomplish it in his time, is basically to give Ethiopia a modern state defined by a common constitution, common citizenship, and imbued with all human rights and requirements. That's it.
Right, thank you. You know, Hilton, as we wind up briefly, if you may comment as well. I don't know how Amnesty has been tracking the situation in Ethiopia regarding also these negotiations.
We have. I mean, one of the things we've been arguing is that in the world's attention on Ukraine and the world's attention now on Gaza, there are a number of conflicts on African soil that are not getting the attention that they need. The one we've been discussing, and I agree with Prof entirely in terms of his analysis, is Ethiopia. But there is also Sudan, and there is also the DRC. So in the case of Ethiopia, one of the things we've been pushing for is the renewal of the UN Human Rights Council mandate to make sure that the eyes of the United Nations continue to document human rights violations and continue to speak out so that the world is kept alert in terms of the violence that we're seeing there. In the Amhara region, there has been concerns about the state of emergency law that has been imposed primarily because to respond to the violence. But in doing that, actually what you have had is you've had restrictions on independent investigators and the media to be able to document what's going on there. So I think these are two of the areas that Amnesty has been concerned about in terms of Ethiopia. Much less, of course, the violence that we're seeing that is affecting primarily civilians.
Thank you. Again. Finally, Nomi Damba.
Well, Kagwanja has enumerated the historical problem to date that Ethiopia faced. And my feeling and my relationship and my study of Ethiopia is that it's a very unique country than any other part of Africa. And I don't think that military conquest or control is going to solve the problem of Ethiopia. It is historical. It is built up, is so deep that something like a federation, United States of Ethiopia, something like that, may be the answer to what is happening. And how is it going to come? Maybe under AU, maybe under UN or wherever, supervised. Such that Tigrayans move on their own, semi-autonomous. The Oromian, they all move on their own. And this Ogaden decide we want to join the Greater Somali, and it is their right, to do that. Without that debate, I'm not sure how one person will be able to keep Ethiopia together.
Right, thank you. I think this is will be a good point to wind up. And just to prime you as well, looking at the new times in Rwanda, this is maybe the effects of a war in Sudan as well, where we have Sudan's top medical university planning relocation to Rwanda. This is what the New Times is saying, if my director may just pick it up. And it says the university's management has already identified 3 options for the new premises as it is here. And still, if you may just pick it up, we have also Kagame and the U.S. intelligence chief discussing tension in eastern DRC. And you can see this telling picture as well from there. President Paul Kagame poses for a photo with White House Director of National Intelligence. This is Avril Haines and other officials after having discussions over the security crisis in eastern DR Congo in Kigali. And according to the Office of the President, the discussion focused on ways to de-escalate tensions and address the root causes of insecurity in eastern DR Congo. That is the latest copy there. In the Tanzania, the East African lawyers are wary of artificial intelligence rise. We're talking about artificial intelligence and the threat of it also to security. That is what we have on the front page of the East African, the Citizen. In the East African, new oil deal will ruin me, as Kenya loses $100 million in Kisumu port business. Uganda investor Mike Mukula, Mukula's 270 million shillings fuel facilities going into disuse. And we have China Daily. Xi is calling for the immediate ceasefire in Gaza. He stresses need for two-state solution during BRICS virtual summit meeting. And also, we showed you The Economist, The World Ahead in 2024, our 90-page guide to the coming year. And also, lastly, Newsweek breakdown what Israel's high-tech security failure means for the US. I want to thank you, Peter Kagwanja, Rungu Houghton,